Okay, so there's a video that is going around on Facebook and on YouTube. It's from ACT TV called Systemic Racism Explained. Makes some interesting arguments, and I thought it's worthwhile going through them a little bit. So we're going to play the video, we'll stop it, we'll discuss. This video is sponsored by the Benham Brothers brand new course, Expert Ownership. You can learn to own a business without it owning you. Stick around to the end of the video to find out more details.
This is Jamal. Jamal is a boy who lives in a poor neighborhood. He has a friend named Kevin, who lives in a wealthy neighborhood. All of Jamal's neighbors are African American, and all of Kevin's neighbors are white. Because Jamal's school district is mostly funded by property taxes, his school is not very well funded. His classrooms are overcrowded, his teachers are underpaid, and he doesn't have access to high-quality tutors or extracurricular activities. Kevin's school district is also funded by property taxes, so his school is very well funded. His classrooms are never crowded, his teachers are very well paid, and he has access to high-quality tutors and lots of extracurricular activities.
So let's talk for a second about school policy. The reality is that if you wanted Jamal to be able to go to Kevin's school, what you'd want is something called school vouchers. You want people to be able to move away from their school districts. One of the chief reasons that Jamal is confined to his local public school is because of Democratic policy that has decided that you must go to school in the district where you live. And this is also why a lot of people have left lower income areas and moved out to higher income areas specifically for better public schools. So if you want Jamal to have the same educational opportunities as Kevin, perhaps you should have school vouchers for private schools, or perhaps you should have charter schools, which is what Mayor Bill de Blasio in New York is fighting against, or perhaps you should break the teachers' unions, which are costing a fortune, particularly on a disproportionate level in areas where they're not spending enough taxpayer dollars. So I'm all for improving Jamal's schools. I'm also all for Jamal having all the same educational opportunities as Kevin. The problem is most Democrats are not.
Kevin and Jamal live only a few streets away from each other. So how come they're growing up in such different worlds with such different opportunities for success? The answer has to do with America's history of systemic racism. To understand it better, let's look at what life was like for Kevin and Jamal's grandparents.
In order to understand what's going to happen in this video, you have to understand how systemic racism is being defined. Systemic racism is really an amorphous term. It could mean many things. It could mean that the institutions of today are racist, in which case everyone would oppose them. Or it could mean that all inequality is explainable by racism, which of course is not sustainable. It's not a good argument. The argument that this video is going to try to make is that all of history has meaning. And that is true. History does have consequences for today. The problem is, as we'll see, the video tries to explain all inequality with reliance on history and no inequality with response to exacerbating levels of income inequality, exacerbating levels of single motherhood, personal decision-making, or any of the other variables that could come into creating the gaps we see today.
Decades after the Civil War, many government agencies started to draw maps dividing cities into sections that were either desirable or undesirable for investment. This practice was called redlining, and it usually blocked off entire black neighborhoods from access to private and public investment. Banks and insurance companies used these maps for decades to deny black people loans and other services based purely on race. Historically speaking, owning a home and getting a college education is the easiest way for an American family to build wealth. But when Jamal's grandparents wanted to buy a house, the banks refused because they lived in a neighborhood that was redlined. So Jamal's grandparents were not able to buy a home, and because colleges could prevent them from attending through legal segregation, their options for higher education were really scarce.
So let's talk about redlining. Redlining became illegal in the United States as early as 1968. The Equal Credit Opportunity Act was followed by the Home Mortgage Disclosure Act of 1975, which was a predecessor to the Community Reinvestment Act, both of which were an attempt to ensure that people who are living in low-income minority neighborhoods could actually get loans. And these things were very effective. In 1992, researchers at the Federal Reserve Bank of Boston tried to look at the data. They collected information on some 30 variables related to lending decisions. They found that virtually all of the difference between minority and non-minority denial rates was explained by those variables. A reanalysis of that information found that black-owned banks were actually lending to white-owned businesses at higher rates than they were lending to black-owned businesses. Furthermore, if it seemed that banks were discriminating against black borrowers on the basis of they needed to have higher credit qualifications, what you would see is lower default rates from black clients of banks, from people who are borrowing money from banks in the black community. There are zero studies that show any of this. So the bottom line is this. Redlining was an evil and awful policy. It was made illegal in the 1960s. By the 1980s, the banks were not lending at disproportionate rates. In fact, if you look at among different communities, as Thomas Sowell has pointed out, Asian Americans get loans more easily than white Americans. That does not mean the banks are being racist toward white Americans on behalf of Asian Americans. When it comes to college education, it is also worth noting that, yes, There were many universities that were segregated. There were many universities that did not allow black people to attend. Since the 1970s, the most prominent measure that has been used in order to admit black students to major universities across the country has been affirmative action, which actively discriminates against people who are not black in favor of black applicants, specifically by ensuring that black applicants don't have to have the same test scores or GPAs in order to get into those same schools. So not only has policy been corrected, it's been overcorrected in these areas.
Kevin's grandparents, on the other hand, got a low-interest loan to buy their first house and got accepted into a handful of top universities, which traditionally only accepted white students. This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids.
The basic assumption of this video is that if your grandparents are rich in the United States, this means that you are rich in the United States. And that if your grandparents are poor in the United States, that means that you are poor in the United States. This is factually untrue. The reality is that income changes over time, that there are an enormous number of people in the United States by percentage who are able to rise from poor to middle class and their children from middle class to wealthy. The biggest problem that we have in the United States right now is not a historic wealth gap. The biggest problem we have is an income gap in the United States. And there's some fascinating statistics surrounding this. There was a Harvard study recently that showed that black males who are growing up in the same household incomes as white males were actually underperforming their white male counterparts, even in high-income neighborhoods. You would think that all of this might imply racism, except for one inconvenient fact in the study. Black women who are growing up in the same high-income neighborhoods as white women growing up in the same high-income neighborhoods, black women were performing at exactly the same or higher rates than white women in those neighborhoods, which would suggest that there are other factors at play other than simple racism. Furthermore, the basic idea that most wealth in the United States is inherited and that millionaires are really only millionaires because their parents were millionaires, that really isn't true either. The vast majority of millionaires and billionaires are people whose parents were not millionaires and billionaires. Chris Hogan, who's a black financial expert, he did a survey of 10,000 people, and what he found was that of those 10,000 people, 74% of millennials believed millionaires inherited their money, 52% of baby boomers did, but only 21% of millionaires received any inheritance at all. Just 16% inherited more than $100,000. Only 3% received an inheritance at or above $1 million. In reality, the best path toward wealth in this country is income mobility, not inherited wealth.
This opened up a wealth of opportunities that they were able to pass on to their kids and grandkids. Even as late as the 1980s, an investigation into the Atlanta real estate market showed that banks were more willing to lend to low-income white families than to middle or upper-income African-American families. As a result, today, for every $100 of wealth held by a white family, black families have $5.04. A 2017 study confirms that redlining is still affecting home values in major cities like Chicago today. This explains how Kevin and Jamal inherited vastly different circumstances.
As it turns out, there are some complicating factors that don't get cited in this video with regard to this data. The Federal Reserve Board economists tried to explain that this data did not take account of differences that were not income-based, things like liabilities, employment history, credit record, and other relevant variables that should have been considered. It should not be particularly surprising that discrimination in the past has impact on the actual income of people who are living in the areas that were denied loans. That shouldn't be a major surprise. But that is not the only disparity, obviously. That New York Times piece they are citing says, quote, they estimate the maps account for 15 to 30% of the overall gaps in segregation and home ownership that they find between the highest risk area and the second highest risk areas. Those were the ones that were being classified. The truth is that when it comes to redlining, you have to look at the gradations as well. There was always going to be a difference in the availability of loans to people who are living in the highest risk areas as opposed to the people who are in the very lowest risk areas. Another factor is that if history does make a difference, then if you are denied loans in a particular area, and if there's less money in those areas, and as crime goes up, and as property taxes kick in, there's not enough money to take, and as schools get worse, obviously that's going to continue to have effect in that particular area. That doesn't mean the same people are living in that area who always lived in that area, or that people who grew up in that area in 1960 necessarily have to live in that area, or that their grandkids have to live in that area in 2020.
Unfortunately, the story doesn't end there. A big part of systemic racism is implicit bias. These are prejudices in society that people are not aware that they have.
One of the big problems with implicit bias, it is very, very difficult to quantify, identify, and studies that supposedly determine that your implicit bias results in real-world action are deeply flawed. Implicit bias assessment tests, for example, are so significantly flawed they are virtually unusable.
Let's go back to Kevin and Jamal. Against all odds, Jamal manages to be the only student from his high school to get accepted into a great university, the same one that Kevin and his high school friends are attending. But after Kevin and Jamal both graduate, Jamal notices that his resume isn't drawing as much interest as Kevin's, even though they graduated from the same program with the exact same GPA. Unfortunately for Jamal, studies show that resumes with white-sounding names get twice as many callbacks as identical resumes with black-sounding names.
The research is actually a lot more interesting than what is being portrayed in this video. There are several studies here. There was one famous study that was done that suggested that first name differentiation was indeed being used by employers. So if your name was Lakeisha, for example, this is the name that is actually used in the study, Lakeisha versus Greg, that you are less likely to get a callback. There was another study that showed a historically black last name like Washington or Jefferson provided no actual differentiation from historically white names, like Greenberg, for example. So if your name was Steve Greenberg versus Steve Jefferson, you're just as likely to get a callback as Steve Jefferson. What that suggests, and this was confirmed by subsequent studies, is that the actual issue here is a question of class discrimination, not an issue of race discrimination. In other words, the reason that people are discriminating against Lakeisha as opposed to against Steve Johnson or Steve Washington is because people are actually using the first name as a stand-in for social class. They are figuring that if you were named Lakeisha, it's because you probably came from a more impoverished background. Now, this is not restricted to the black community. This happens in the Jewish community as well. If you get an applicant and the applicant's name is Ben, you might treat that applicant different than if that person's name is Ben Yamin. You might treat a Menachem different than you treat a Mike. And that is because you are trying to read into the person your perceptions of culture or perceptions of class, not really perceptions of race. That's really, really important when you look at these particular studies and suggest that racial discrimination rather than class distinctions are at the basis of whatever hiring discrimination is happening here.
Implicit bias is one of the reasons why the black unemployment rate is twice the rate of white unemployment.
Well, this tends to neglect one key factor. What did you major in? What did you study? It turns out that people who major in education aren't going to do as well as people who major in engineering. According to research from the Center on Education and the Workforce at Georgetown University, this is a quote from PBS, African American college students are more likely to pursue majors that lead to low-paying jobs, setting up many for future debt and underemployment. Over time, these occupational choices contribute to the wealth and opportunity gap between whites and blacks that spans generations. Anthony Carnival, who's the director of the program, he says basically African Americans have been going to the right church but sitting in the wrong pew. In a way, they are using education to climb the social and economic ladder, but they're being steered toward majors that will make them low earners. So, in other words, there are several confounding factors that are not being taken into account in this video. 1, what college did you go to? 2, what did you major in? And 3, what kind of job did you get afterward?
You can see evidence of systemic racism in every area of life. The disparities in family wealth, incarceration rates, political representation, and education are all examples of systemic racism.
Now we reach the crux of the matter. The basic idea here is that any inequality can be chalked up to systemic racism. We are now ghost hunting. Notice, they've said nothing in this video about incarceration. Nothing about incarceration. The simple assumption is that if more black people percentage-wise are arrested than white people, that must be due to systemic racism and not due to the number of crimes being committed by individuals who make a decision to commit a crime. When it comes to representation, the truth is there are many, many black Americans in Congress. We've had a black president of the United States. People choosing to run and people choosing to vote, that is an aspect of American freedom. And when it comes to education, there are plenty of affirmative action programs that exist at virtually every major university. In fact, there are entire university systems like the University of California that have gotten rid of the SAT and the ACT as admissions criteria specifically because they weren't allowing enough minority students to attend. So to attribute all inequality to systemic racism is simply to say that everything you don't like must be due to systemic racism.
Unfortunately, the biggest challenge with systemic racism is that there's no single person or entity responsible for it, which makes it very hard to solve. So what can you do? The first thing you can do is work towards becoming more aware of your own implicit biases.
We should always, as decent people, be re-examining our own biases and trying to wipe out bad thoughts we may be having about other people. But the idea that something as vague as you had a bad thought about a group is now responsible for the income inequality between black and white is sort of an absurd contention in the absence of any available evidence.
What are some prejudices that you might hold that you're not aware of? Second, let's acknowledge that the consequences of slavery and Jim Crow laws are still affecting access to opportunity today.
It is certainly plausible that slavery and Jim Crow have affected how people's paths have gone in life and the circumstances of their birth. But the question is, how much? If we are going to change policy, and if we are going to effectuate change, shouldn't we be focused more on what are the bad policies today that specifically are keeping people down, and what behaviors can we change today to make our opportunities better, rather than focusing in on slavery or Jim Crow? The fact is that even if you buy into the entire narrative of systemic racism promoted by this video, it changes nothing, and the video is even acknowledging as much.
As a result, we should support systemic changes that create more equal opportunities for everyone. Increasing public school funding and making it independent from property taxes would be a great start, so that poor and wealthy districts can receive equal access to resources.
The suggestion that simply pouring money into public schools is somehow going to be the solution has been belied by nearly every independent study ever done of public education. Obviously, we should be spending more on schools where not enough spending is going on, where there aren't school books or there aren't enough desks. But the real problem that's existing in educational performance has very little to do with income and a lot more to do with the access to educational opportunity provided in homes. If you have a single family home, it is very difficult for mom to be able to help with homework. If you don't allow kids to go to better schools outside their neighborhood, rather than simply pouring money into failed neighborhood schools, then you're not really granting opportunity.
Systemic problems require systemic solutions. Luckily, we're all part of the system, which means that we all have a role to play in making it better. Peace.
It's easy enough to say that we all have a role in making the system better, but when you suggest very few practical solutions other than rote democratic policies that have been failed nearly every time they've tried, it makes it difficult to believe this isn't just a political ploy rather than an argument in favor of bettering individual human lives. To deny the effects of history would be idiotic. History obviously has consequences. And to deny that racism exists would be similarly idiotic. But to attribute every problem in American life to racism or inequity is to be foolish and counterproductive and not to make the world a better place. For more on a lot of these topics, go check out my brand new book, How to Destroy America in 3 Easy Steps, all about the attempt to divide Americans by suggesting that American philosophy, culture, and history are responsible for all wrongs in the modern world. Go check out that book. It's available everywhere. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please give it a like. We really appreciate it. And check out my show, The Ben Shapiro Show. Now, there are a lot of folks who reach the pinnacle of business life and they are just as miserable as they ever were. It doesn't have to be that way. You should be able to own your business without it owning you. And this is why I want to tell you about my friends, the Benham Brothers. I know them. They are good Christian men. They have over a dozen businesses, including a real estate portfolio in over 35 states, and they didn't sell their soul to get it. You might remember their names. They were supposed to have a reality TV show on HGTV, and they were basically thrown out of reality TV for the great sin of being Christian because of their commitment to conservative values. So-called business coaches will tell you that your life has to take a backseat to your business, but David and Jason Benham, they know that that is not true. They are proof that that is a lie. Just recently, the Benham Brothers launched a new course. It's called Expert Ownership. It's the model they use to build all of their businesses. Whether you're sick of the 9-to-5 or whether you're just eager to get a new business started, or whether you've had a business for 10 years, Expert Ownership can help you achieve your goals. To celebrate the launch of that brand new course, they're offering 15% off to new members. You can check out a preview of the course and take advantage of that discount over at benhambrothers.com/Ben. That's BENHAM brothers.com/Ben for 15% off. You can also find a link in the description of this video. Head on over there and check out their brand new course, Expert Ownership.